Okay, Dr. Pearl, welcome to the Spoon Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be
And
here.
yeah, and before we get going, should I call you Dr. Pearl? Can I call you Jocelynn Pearl or
You can
Jocelynn?
call me Jocelyn.
Jocelynn, okay. It'd be kind of awkward to call you Jocelynn Pearl the whole time, wouldn't it? So,
Yeah.
well, you are a biotech scientist, a podcaster, a company builder. I became interested in decentralized science and DeSci movement and how Web3 may alleviate some issues with traditional science, and that's exactly what you are looking at. So I'm excited to have you here, and most importantly, maybe out of all that, you're a Seattle resident too. Two Seattle people talking on a podcast, which is always great.
Love it.
Back
Love
to back
meeting
weeks.
other Seattle creatives.
Yeah, yeah. Well, welcome to the show. So I was kind of researching some of your publications. You have a number of them out there. You published on E16Z. You published on Exponential View. And one of the publications you put out there had a really cool DeSci landscape map with all of these companies. I love to visualize these things. And when I was looking at this map, what I noticed is a lot of them are around what you would expect, scientific research, et cetera, but not a whole lot on food. And we'll get back to that because I think there's maybe some reasons for that. But can you tell us a little bit about the current market and what decentralized science is?
Sure. So decentralized science, which many people call DeSci for short, it's kind of a play on an earlier movement in term of decentralized finance, which came out of, the crypto movement. Essentially the idea that, we no longer needed to rely on this centralized banking system and everyone could control their own assets and decentralized finance, right? And so I think a number of people started thinking about how to apply blockchain technology and these themes of Web3 to science and actually improve how we go about conducting scientific research and doing things like drug development and publishing papers. And there were a number of early themes and discussions that the community centered on. And I was interested in the space. Some of the first conversations I had were in particular around scientific publishing and how do we alleviate some of the issues with this kind of fraught, greedy, extractive system that many of us kind of play into over the course of our careers by publishing in big journals like Nature, Science, Cell. And just as background, the way it works is, normally when you go to write an article for a magazine, they're going to pay you for your work. In science, you actually pay the journal to publish your paper. So researchers at universities who are funded by taxpayer dollars pay on the order of, let's say, $5,000 to have their article published. They often pay more for color figures, which doesn't really make sense because, most of these journals are now mostly online. And then they're also giving away the rights to that paper. So then it lives behind a paywall oftentimes. And the people on the consumer side who are trying to read that literature and learn from it, as is, the goal of disseminating information and scientific, research, then also have to pay to read it. So it's a very odd way of doing this.
It
and
is
ripe for disruption. And
Well, I didn't even know that. I mean, obviously I don't publish articles in scientific journals, but it seems like the idea of paying the journal will lead to maybe possibly messed up economic incentives for the journal operators, right? Like they're not necessarily looking for the best research out there. They're looking for the people who can cough up and pay to play, if you will.
Yeah, that's maybe less of a problem than you would think. But I think the bottom line for me is that that's money that could go into the research, So, these researchers, if they're coming from the academic side, they have, say, 100K to spend on their work, and 5K of that is going to actually publishing the paper and sharing it with the world. That could instead be going back into their science and paying for reagents and things like that. But yeah, it's a very odd system. It's many of these companies make better profits than some of the biggest companies out there. I mean, like better profit margins than Google, for instance, which is pretty obscene. So
And
it's, hopefully going to be disrupted in the coming years in some
yeah,
way.
yeah, like so many industries that were previously analog that went online, the cost of production for publishing a journal has gone way down, and now what's interesting is they kept so many of the original ideas of such as restricting access, right? So it's behind I'm assuming these are behind paywalls, so they're not
Many of
necessarily
them
freely
are.
they're not necessarily freely available to share, despite the fact they're getting paid to put this up online, and the cost for them has gone down over the past couple of decades. Just generally. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, and just like um even on the researcher side, like these journals have actually gone after researchers who have tried to share their papers with others. There's a popular platform called ResearchGate where a number of people, including myself, will share their PDFs with others so that they can read them instead of paying, $30, $40, $50 to access a PDF. And many of these companies will actually go on there and send emails and say, you can't do this. This is, essentially against the license.
I'm shocked.
So
I'm shocked that an incumbent player that likes the old way of doing things is fighting against the new guard that's trying to disrupt them. Just shocked.
yeah.
So this idea that you want to share things more freely using Web3 philosophies and technologies is something that's starting to gain momentum. Talk a little bit about where we are. It seems like when I look at the map, for example, there's a ton of these DAOs. Are a lot of these? What is the main point of these organizations to basically encourage each other, find like people in the community, and share ideas?
Yeah, exactly. I call it like a Reddit forum on steroids. Essentially, people kind of aggregate around particular ideas. So one of the early DAOs that formed is called Vita DAO, and they're focused on longevity research and advancing human health span or lifespan. And so they, a number of people came into this Discord server, which that's one of the things that's neat about the space is a lot of the DAOs, anyone can kind of access this community and start interacting and participating in things like working groups that form. So they have, a deal flow working group that reviews deals that are coming into the community, and then the community can vote on those. And the DAO, like, structure itself, there's actually like a software protocol behind it that allows the community to vote and determine how they're going to go about, working on their shared mission. And yeah, a lot of it was like the early days kind of focused on life science, but I think there's a growing movement on more of the climate science side that goes by regenerative finance or refi. A lot of interesting projects in that space. And yeah, there's definitely folks from different areas now kind of getting attracted by this idea of like online collectives working on these things, sharing in the, asset management in the case of things like drug development, and moving the science forward.
I mean, traditional heavy science research is very centralized by its nature almost. I mean, you have tens of millions of dollars going into new biotechs and funding, and you get these companies get people together in a lab somewhere. Universities, oftentimes people are just brought together by proximity. And this idea of decentralizing it by using these new technologies is really, really interesting in that you might be able to get access or inputs from people across the globe. And and then you also mentioned the funding side, right? This idea of funding. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. One of the things I think is valuable to keep in mind from a historical perspective is that, a lot of our research funding, at least here in the United States, has come from large government agencies and is performed through this grant system. And while that works great for a very particular type of research, I think it misses things that don't fit the norm. And even within the like kind of normal academic hierarchical structure of people who are very good at writing grants and have been doing that, for years, there's still a lot of research that goes unfunded that is valuable and could potentially, advance human progress. So I think there's been a desire to find alternative funding structures that could work for getting some of these different types of projects off the ground. And along those lines, Gitcoin within the Web3 space really is a kind of grants organization that organizes these grant funding rounds, and has recently done a DeSci round that funded a number of different projects, really interesting kind of across the board, global. Like you mentioned, there were some teams from South America working on dolphin research. There's just all kinds of interesting things coming out in this space. And I think we're seeing just like a new iteration of crowdfunding of science, essentially, that relies on crypto. And that's kind of exciting because crowdfunding for science hasn't taken off the way it has for other communities and sectors, like Kickstarter works really well for particular types of companies and gaming companies, things like that. But crowdfunding of science hasn't been as successful.
Walk me through how one of these companies, like the Dolphin organization, the group of researchers that got some funding via this new mechanism for dolphin research, how does it work? Are they applying for it, and then at some point do they offer up like an NFT? How is this? What's the process of how it works?
Yeah, there's a lot of different structures being explored. On the grant side, it is simply an application, and then similar to like a Kickstarter, you're promoting that project online through your network, through Twitter, and that's something that I think is an interesting aspect of the DAO space in general, like beyond science, within the art DAOs as well. They kind of rely on their community and all of the people in there to help magnify the sale of NFTs or the art that they're selling. So yeah, within the science side, a lot of them are kind of marketing, amplifying to bring in more donors for their project. Some of them are exploring NFTs as a way of tokenizing the research that's happening, or giving people ownership in that project. So if tokens are challenging to think about, it's sometimes easier to just think of it as like shared ownership or money, equity. There's a lot of different like use cases of tokens right now, and I think it's fun to see like the exploration in that space.
Turning to the food side, so much of the cutting edge in future food has sprung out of a foundation of research from the biotech world, from the medical world. I mean, if you look at some of the founders of some of the big companies like Upside Food, which is, one of the leading cellular lab-grown meat companies, the founder is Uma Valetti, who is a heart researcher and heart doctor. Pat Brown from Impossible Foods did some seminal early research in DNA arrays and DNA research. So it's not that surprising that is happening, but where this future food space seems to be lagging, what I'm seeing in terms of the movement on your side, on the kind of the hard tech, biotech side, is there's not a lot of movement around DeSci and kind of sharing knowledge. It seems like it's lagging because it's earlier stage maybe, and oftentimes these companies are huddling around and keeping so much stuff close to the vest because what they're building is very early. I'd be interested to see, do you think that maybe these cutting edge food companies could benefit from some of the things that you're seeing in, for example, the medical research side in DeSci?
Yeah, I mean, the question of we could call it closed versus open source.
Yeah.
I think there's an ongoing tension, in the biotech space and in many spaces that rely on IP to advance. For me, I find it really compelling that more biotech companies want to share information, that they want to share things like protocol knowledge and what it took to start the company, term sheets and all of that. And there's a lot of like redundant experiments that happen, and things like, non-human primate studies, which we could get into like the ethics of, multiple companies kind of running the same study. So I hope that, some of this like decentralization, democratization, zeitgeist encourages companies to share information that it can with others, so that, it strengthens the space as a whole. Because at the end of the day, like the likelihood of any given company, at least like on the drug development side, of like actually getting to the finish line is very small. And, if we think back to like the core motivation of what we're doing within drug development, it's to help patients. So, I'm a believer of like sharing more knowledge, but also completely understand why companies operate in this closed source kind of stealth approach. Now, on the food development side, I could imagine, similar to like what we went through with the pandemic, a lot of orgs shared protocols of like how to do COVID testing so that many people could start up testing labs. I think there's aspects of that. I'm not a food scientist, but like things like which bioreactors work the best, which reagents, are working well for this product. Those are the kinds of things like I'd love to see more people sharing.
I think a lot of the knowledge sharing there is some knowledge sharing happening, right? It's not completely closed, but more through traditional formats like industry conferences. There's a number of industry associations being formed. One just last week called the Precision Fermentation Alliance, which they're using synthetic biology technologies and essentially, making having molecules become like protein factories. And about 10 companies got together to share ideas and how that's happening. There's another group called the Open Cellular Agriculture Group, which isn't necessarily Web3, but it's kind of this idea of, hey, let's open up a community and share some of our research. There's another group in Japan called the CONET Consortium, but it's essentially an idea of open sourcing some research for cellular agriculture. So it seems like there's some open sourcing or some open sourcing curiousness and some knowledge sharing, but it's through maybe more traditional or kind of Web 2 type formats.
Yeah, I mean, like how, I guess, to frame my motivations, how it comes out, or how the knowledge is shared at the end of the day. Like, I don't care too much if it's in a Web 2 or Web 3 format, as long as like we are advancing the field as a whole, right? But that's exciting that there's lots of, new people putting out open source information and sharing knowledge. Like, I mean, on my side of the industry within drug development, whenever someone goes to a conference and presents like non-human primate data, that's huge. Like, not everyone does that. Not every company that's running these studies is sharing that type of information, and it really helps everybody. So yeah, I love to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the motivations are similar, and kind of the desire for a better world outcome is the same, whether that's, vaccine, DNA research. We're seeing those same kind of motivations for why these people are starting these companies in future food, because they see, hey, there's a ticking clock for the world. There's too much carbon emissions. We can't feed 10 billion people using traditional industrial meat processing. We need to move towards more sustainable approaches, whether that's plant-based or whether that's precision fermentation, whether that's cellular agriculture. So I think the motivations are there. It's just maybe the industry is a little newer. It's more nascent. Mm-hmm. And I think we're starting to see early signs percolating that they're going to move towards some of the things that we're seeing in what I would call a more mature industry, which is, biotech and medical research.
Awesome.
So where do you see all this going? Do you think that in the future, medical researchers, future food researchers will start to use these concepts like DAOs to advance their ideas and share knowledge to get funding? Do you think that's going to be much more common in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think where I'm at right now with the space, after kind of observing it for, I guess, a couple of years, time is warped, is that, doing the experiment is always worthwhile. Like, I think that's kind of the spirit of American, capitalism, or however you want to characterize our system, is that disrupting things, trying to change things up, finding different sources of funding, finding different ways of organizing people and doing work is worthwhile, because there might be more progress as a result. And in the case of, drug development, that means, more drugs are getting developed and helping people who are suffering from disease. So yeah, I think I am still somewhat hopeful, and I think it's been a huge learning lesson for me to just dive into new organization structures and like really kind of pressure test what it means to do decentralized work, and what does it mean to try to lead within some of these organizations compared to a traditional biotech. But who knows, like we're in a crypto winter now, and it's just hard to say. Like, I think things can change so quickly. So I'm not necessarily, I wouldn't say that like everything's going to happen in DAOs in the future or anything like that. I think my place is more of, it's been an interesting experiment to see how people can organize online and form collectives and do work together in a new way that has been kind of enabled by the internet as a whole, and the pandemic, and having to operate through the lens of your computer. But yeah, we'll see. The experiment is still being run.
Experiment is still being run, and Dr. Jocelynn Pearl will continue to follow that. And if people want to follow along with you, you explore some of these ideas on your podcast. What are the name of those podcasts? Where can people find them?
Yeah, so I started a show a couple years ago called Lady Scientist Podcast, and I interview women scientists across the board. We have professors, we have people on the biotech side, we have C-level executives, we have graduate researchers, and so that's a great place to learn about career journeys and the type of science that these different women are working on. That show is on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. And then I also did a show called Ultra Rare, the podcast, where we interviewed some of the leaders in this decentralized science movement. And again, wherever you listen to podcasts, you can check that out. And that's kind of, goes with the decentralized science landscape that I put together with our team at Ultra Rare. And we also have a wiki that's a Google Doc that anyone can comment on and add organizations to, that we kind of keep track of what's happening in this space.
I was just on that this morning, checking it out. Great resource. And I think a lot of people can get that and your podcast from your Twitter feed, which is your name. What is Dr. Jocelynn Pearl? Is it
Jocelynn Pearl, yep.
All right. Hey, well, thank you so much, Dr. Pearl, for spending some time with me today.
Thanks so much, Michael. This was great.